dresses with leather shoes with pointy toes. You can also see Yoder, who's the balding gentleman front and center, as the captain of the debate team there with the Lyceum Literary Society from Juniata. Flanking him are two others who joined him in representing the college at its first intercollegiate debate at Susquehanna University in Selinsgrove. The question they were considering was whether or not the United States should retain possession of the Philippines. So these were very active years for Yoder, 1901 to 1904. He seemed to be involved in every athletic event on campus. He was involved in musical events. He was involved in debate. And he also began research and writing about his home community in Belleville. The history, and especially the musical traditions of his Amish family and ancestors. And that research would enter his book projects many years later. At this time, he first began to transcribe the tunes to Amish hymns that had been preserved since the 16th century in oral tradition. The Amish hymnal, which is called the Asbunt, I have a small version of it here. You can see it's very fine print in German. So there are these long hymns which indicate the name of the tune that these long hymns are to be sung to, but there are no notes. And so within the community, over time, in oral tradition, people would carry the tradition of the tunes, but because over time they were sung very slowly, it became very difficult to remember them. And until Yoder asked the song leaders from his home community to sing the tunes for him so that he could transcribe them, no one had ever written them down. Until he published the tunes in 1942, ethnomusicologists who studied the music believed they had been entirely lost. At the same time, Yoder took choral groups from Juniata back to Mennonite churches in Big Valley to sing. And this model of moving between the two communities would continue throughout the rest of his life. After he graduated from Juniata, Yoder made his living mostly as a teacher and song leader. From 1905 to 1909, he taught logic, math, and coached the debate and basketball teams at Central Normal School, which is now Lock Haven University. During the summers, he traveled throughout Pennsylvania, leading singing at teachers' institutes. And these were continuing education programs for public school teachers. In a photograph from the Huntington collection, we see him with the teacher's training program he offered in Everett, Pennsylvania. Yoder's in the front row to the right of the women. The gentleman to his right is John Hooley, who was his roommate at Juniata. In these years, Yoder also began working as a singing school instructor in Mennonite and Brethren church communities in central and eastern Pennsylvania. The photograph with a group of Mennonites, probably taken in Lancaster County sometime before 1911, you can see Yoder in the background with his head turned. That's also here in the Huntington collection. Singing in parts was an innovation borrowed by these conservatives from the progressive Sunday school movement. And in many areas, Yoder was the pioneer in teaching these communities how to read music and sing harmony. And now it's interesting, it's come to be in many of these communities, the singing in harmony is a traditional form, and people imagine they've been doing it forever. Back to Europe. I mean, there's this kind of amnesia or forgetting that this was actually only an innovation of the early 20th century. In the summer, Yoder served as a song leader at teachers' institutes. Each year, he published a new songbook, and during much of this time, he kept a home with John Hooley and his family in Ivyland, near Richboro, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia. In a promotional brochure from around World War I, you see he uses an Arch Street business address in Philadelphia. This war gave music a whole new meaning, the brochure says. And inside the pamphlet, he quotes Major General Wood, who said, "A singing army is a fighting army." At this point, he's come a long way from his Amish background. In 1915, he began working full-time as a motivational speaker and college recruiter for Juniata. So even though his base was outside Philadelphia, he was working for Juniata and traveling around the state by train, mostly to rural areas, to encourage high school students to consider higher education. In the summer, he served the Teachers' Institutes and led singing at evangelistic services and other meetings. We have a poster from the collection here in Huntington announcing a speaking engagement in Greensburg in western Pennsylvania. Then, in 1932, at the age of 60, Yoder finally settled down. He married Emily Lane and bought a house here in Huntington on Mifflin Street near the college. The photograph of the two of them was taken later, probably in the early 1950s. If you look closely, you can see that Emily is wearing the Girl Scouts emblem on her lapel. She was a scout leader and superintendent of the Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church. For both of them, this was their first marriage. Then, in 1940, at the age of 68, he published his first book, Rosanna of the Amish, which tells the story of his mother's life and explains Amish culture and practices, defending them from negative stereotypes that were very common at that time. 1 year later, he retired from his job as a college recruiter. From 1942 until 1954, he published 4 more books about Amish life. Through those dozen years, he shifted from being a defender of Amish life and practices to being a critic and reformer. Yoder was a complicated man. Sometimes a visionary, he seemed to be far ahead of his time. Sometimes he seemed to be an insensitive nuisance to his home community. He was a passionate advocate of organic farming and vegetarianism. From the late 19th century, he argued for temperance and women's rights. His final pamphlet, The Prayer Veil Analyzed, called into question Amish and Mennonite practices of requiring female members to wear the head covering. And for that, in the early 1950s, he was denied communion at Maple Grove Mennonite Church, the congregation's oldest member. Born less than a decade after the battle at Gettysburg, Yoder died well after the end of the Korean War. In one of his last lectures, he warned about the dangers of the atomic bomb, citing the biblical passage from Deuteronomy, "Choose life so that you and your children may live." In 1956, Yoder died from stomach cancer in the hospital here in Huntington. He was buried in the Amish Mennonite Cemetery at Locust Grove near Belleville, identified by the name of his most successful and important literary effort, Rosanna of the Amish. You notice his wife's name isn't on the stone, just the name of his book. So that sort of ends my brief sketch of Yoder's life. And before I turn to a more detailed discussion of the book, Rosanna of the Amish, I wonder, Tracy, if there are any here who knew Yoder or who have heard stories about him who could contribute to our sense of his character, or maybe there are questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. It sounds like Joseph W. Yoder's life was a pretty compelling story all by itself. And we do have some questions from our audience, but we want to start with Alona Bulrick, who is the Executive Director of the Huntington County Arts Council. And Alona, we would love for you to tell us a little bit about the art space where we're standing, and then you go ahead with the first question for Julia.
Well, thank you, Tracy. This is an exciting time for the arts in Huntington County. The art space is a new gathering place. We just had fiber artists gather here last week for the first Thursday of every month, no experience necessary. But we also offer exhibits here, concerts, presentations such as this. Since 1972, the Arts Council has been providing arts and cultural opportunities to our constituency, including professional and amateur artists and the public in general. So we invite everybody to come to our programs. Now, Julia, it was just fascinating to hear about Joseph Yoder. but you are also an artist, a poet in particular, and your opening poem reflects a little bit, I think, on your struggle with your past and as an artist. Could you please elaborate what you have learned during your research as an artist?
Well, one thing I learned from Yoder's story was that, at least for him, and I think this is true for me too, and maybe true for any artist who comes from a strong traditional background, the American notion that you leave home and go out into the world and don't go home again was not the story of Yoder's life. And even though, particularly during his younger years, he was gone for long stretches of time from this area, he was always in conversation with people back in the valley. Someone I spoke with in Big Valley, I interviewed a lot of people in that community who remembered him. In the summer of 1995 is when I conducted my research. And at that time, there were quite a lot of people still living who knew him. Many of them have since died. But one man said to me, he went to the world, but why did he keep coming back to us? And I think in that wonderful observation is this idea that no artist who leaves a closed community is gone forever. So that was an important thing for me to learn as a beginning writer and to understand. Also from Yoder's example, I learned the necessity of being respectful and having an attitude of humility toward the communities one comes from, because he didn't always carry himself in those ways, particularly in the ways he related to his community.
Hi. Having read Rosanna of the Amish and some other books that are largely based on someone's personal history, I'm always struck by the little parts in the book that say, don't get rid of anything. Keep all those letters and do something with them. And I think there was a lot of foresight in Yoder's family putting the pictures and his letters and things where they could be accessible. How often do you, as an academic, get access to things like that? And how often do you wish someone had saved and preserved those memories of the past?
That's an interesting question. You know, what gets saved and what gets discarded is selective. In Yoder's papers, it was clear to me that he hoped that someone would come along someday and write about him. Because in pencil, sometimes handwritten at the top of correspondence or song lyrics that he'd composed or something, he would explain what the thing was, just in case the researcher someday didn't know what she was looking at. On the other hand, there's an enormous body of correspondence that got destroyed, and that's the correspondence between Yoder and John Hooley. And those years, about 15 years when he lived in eastern Pennsylvania with John and John's family, for the longest time I couldn't figure out where in the world he was. And it was only in looking in some Juniata College presidential correspondence that I came across a note that Yoder had sent, turning in his expenses when he was traveling around, that sort of gave me the idea that maybe he was living at this other address, and then through census and tax records tracked it down. So I think even longer ago, before telephone, before email, before these ephemeral kinds of communication, people were choosing how they would present themselves to the future.
I have a question about, in your research, in his early life, would you believe there was a single event or a series of events or an individual or something having to do with his early education that may have caused him to be the individual that he was and step out of the mainstream of the culture he was raised in? You had mentioned a side about his mother and being of the Irish ancestry.
Well, he certainly created a mythology about his family. He talked about the Irish side